Next time, you're only reading the first half of the Saga of the Volsungs, right? The first half is the kind of fantasy mythological part, and then the second half is much closer to a kind of straightforward historical chronicle, which has a lot less to do with what we're doing in the class. So I really only want you to read up to Sigurd's funeral. That's the part that matters. Okay. Do you have any questions about anything? I mean, we chatted a little bit before class, but
I do have a few comments.
Okay.
Reading it, it reminded me of Herodotus.
Okay.
From the Greek side of things.
Sure.
Yeah. Just accounts of war efforts, like what's his name? Who is the Persian emperor he followed?
Darius.
Xerxes?
Xerxes, yeah, that's right,
Xerxes.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
It reminded me of him following Xerxes into battle. All of it is just accounts of what happened, as Herodotus does. I don't think he wrote it in, I think he wrote it more in prose than poetry.
Yeah. Or at least it's usually translated into prose. Actually, most ancient Greek writing is actually in verse. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but we tend to translate it into prose.
Okay, so whatever I was reading was probably translated.
Yeah. But I think one thing that I think you are right to note here that these are not like fantastic accounts, right? There's no magic here. There are no gods intervening, no monsters, no shit like that, right? You know, these are fairly straightforward, realistic accounts of battle. What else did you notice about these poems?
They had a lesson, more or less.
Okay.
Same thing with Herodotus, how he was trying to teach people through his historiography. It felt like that both poems were trying to teach the importance of weird.
Okay, yeah, they're both kind of like what we saw frequently in Beowulf. They're putting this concept of weird into Christian terms, right? So it's clear that this is something that has not quite lost its grip on Anglo-Saxon culture, even after they've been Christianized for almost 300 years, right? These poems are both probably products of the mid-10th century to early 11th century. We know, for example, that Brunanburh could not have been composed any earlier than 937, because that's when the battle happened to be. But most scholars think it's probably at least a couple decades later than that. But close enough to the actual events that they haven't turned the heroes into the generals into heroes or gods, and they haven't had any fantasy elements to it. Brunanburh also appears in a historical chronicle. The manuscript it's taken from is referred to, or the set of manuscripts it's taken from, are collectively referred to as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. The date of the Battle of Maldon, not the battle, but the poem, is a little bit more open to dispute. So the battle itself takes place in 991. And there are arguments back and forth over whether the poem was written relatively close to that date, or at some distance from it. So those who favor an early date, so like early 11th century, point to its realism as one factor in favor of an early date, right? That again, like it's not so far in time that these heroes have become legendary yet, right? There are no legendary mythological elements. And also the references to the Saxon king at the time, Ethelred, known to history as the Unready, and mostly recalled as an incompetent king who paid the Vikings off rather than standing and fighting.
Since I'm bad with names, that one's from Battle of Maldon, right?
Yeah, this is Battle of Maldon.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. The references to Ethelred are not unflattering, which suggests that his historical reputation was not yet established. And indeed, like this may have even been written while he was still king. Those who favor a later date, say 12th century, do so mostly on the basis of language. That the spelling and vocabulary are in a late dialect of West Saxon, as opposed to the East Saxon that the warriors in the battle would have spoken, which also, if we localize the language of the poem, then it doesn't correlate either to where the battle was fought or the time around when the battle was fought. So this suggests a composition date that is later.
Where do you lie on that?
I don't have a dog in this fight. For me, again, because for the context of the class, I give you this information to give you a sense of where scholars stand on these things. In this case, I'm not going to take a position because what I'm most interested in is what Tolkien gets from these particular poems. In particular from the Battle of Maldon, which was one of his frequent teaching texts. And he was responsible for the Anglo-Saxon part of the syllabus. So a lot of these texts would have been part of his regular teaching repertoire. He also wrote and published on the Battle of Maldon. In particular, a short essay in the early 50s on the concept of Ulfermode, or how the word Ulfermode ought to be translated. Now, Ulfermode, it's not an especially common Anglo-Saxon word, and because it's not that common, its meaning is sometimes disputed. So Ulfermode is translated by Tolkien as something like overweening pride. So, we want to get back to Herodotus and the Greeks, right? It's similar to that Greek concept of hubris, right?
There's a whole lot of that.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea here, or the central idea of Tolkien's essay is that having been indoctrinated by this cult of heroism that we find in much early Germanic poetry, Bertnaut, the leader, or the alderman of Essex, alderman is something like, it means something similar to earl. Our word earl is descended directly from the Norse jarl. And alderman is sort of the Anglo-Saxon equivalent of that.
I played Skyrim, I know what a jarl is.
Yeah, yeah. I like playing Skyrim in the summer.
Oh, you'll get,
Yeah.
put enough mods on it, you'll get addicted to it.
Oh yeah, yeah, well yeah, just you know, running through, you know, those ice-capped mountains and all that around Winterholds in July in Georgia. And
Gives
just
you a different feeling, huh?
yeah, yeah. But yeah, so Beardnaut, having absorbed this warrior ethos, makes a decision that ends up costing him the battle and his men their lives, right? So if we look at the way this is translated in our edition here on page 104, it probably helps too if we have some means of visualizing what the battlefield looks like. So, first off, to give you a sense of what England looked like and how it was divided up in the Anglo-Saxon period, I'm going to show you a map of the 7 Saxon kingdoms and their nearest neighbors.
While it's loading, I do have one question.
Yeah, sure.
Given that a lot of Arthurian literature takes place in the 700s era, or so would one of these 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms be considered a Camelot kind of area?
Probably not. Winchester was a Saxon site and is sometimes associated with Arthur. But one thing that we have to remember about the Arthurian myth is that the key word there is myth. There probably was no King Arthur, especially if there was no Saxon invasion, because a big part of the story is that he was the one who fought back the Saxon invasion, right? If Arthur is really more a kind of vehicle for stories. He's a kind of semi-legendary figure in some of this late Celtic literature, and then he really the idea of Camelot is really developed in French romances of the 12th century and later.
So it was just pretty much stories around the fire kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. There are references in some historical chronicles to a figure called Arthur, but it's never really specified who or what he is. And the chronicles in which he's mentioned are considered unreliable. So this is what England and southern Scotland would have looked like in terms of political divisions in about the 9th century. So Essex, Sussex, Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria are all Saxon kingdoms. And in fact, like the southern 3 kingdoms here, right, essentially they're contractions of East Saxons, South Saxons, and West Saxons. We still use some of these names to refer to parts of England, in particularly Essex and Sussex. Kent was an allied kingdom that was where the Jutes were settled, and East Anglia, of course, was where the Angles were settled. Mercia and Northumbria are also Saxon kingdoms. Now, by the end of the 9th century, Alfred of Wessex, sometimes referred to as Alfred the Great, after pushing back Norse invaders, is given the title Bretwalda. Now, Bretwalda is another one of those words, the literal meaning of which is disputed, but we can infer from context that what it means is ruler of what comes to be England, right? So Alfred, who was of the house of Wessex, or he was the king of Wessex, is regarded as ruler over all of these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms now. So by the time of the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, the descendants of Alfred the Great rule all of these Saxon kingdoms. But they don't rule what's now Wales. They don't rule the kingdom of Strathclyde here in what's now southern Scotland. They don't rule anything north of Northumbria. And they do not rule Ireland. Ireland, especially the area around Dublin, is a patchwork of Celtic kingdoms, and the Vikings actually control Dublin. Dublin was a Viking city founded on an old monastery, which the Vikings probably burned down. There are also Viking kingdoms in the North Isles around Scotland. Somewhere in Mercia is an area called the Danelaw, where Vikings settled.
So coming from Scandinavia, going around and finding Dublin, they turned out a monastery that's there, and that's after Roman rules all of it.
Yeah, well, the Romans never made it to Ireland or to Scotland, really.
So they just, from Europe to the...
Yeah. So, where was I going with this? Right, so most of the kings that we're reading about in these poems are Alfred's descendants. Right, Athelstan in the Battle of Brunanburh, his much younger half-brother Edmund, referred to here as Edmund the Atheling. And Atheling means something like noble or prince. Right? The Atheling was the name given to the body of people who were permitted to inherit the throne. So yeah, if you were an Atheling, it meant that you were someone who was in the line of succession.
And then that goes down to some certain point until a revolution shows up, and that revolution will change who the ruling family of England is at some point later on in time.
Yeah, and it is the House of Wessex throughout the 10th century. And then a Viking dynasty actually takes over from Ethelred, who's king at the end of the 10th, beginning of the 11th centuries. Ethelred is a descendant of Alfred. He's part of his house. His reign is broken up into two periods by a guy by the name of Svein Forkbeard. And then after Ethelred dies, Spain's grandson, I think, Canute, becomes king of England. So yeah, there is a period during which England is ruled by a Danish dynasty.
What is, okay, sorry, can you move just a little bit?
Oh yeah, sure.
I need the Ethelwing.
Ethelwing, yes. Okay, so to get back to the Battle of Maldon, because I feel like in giving you context, I veered wildly off of my original topic and had to remember for a second what it was. Over mode. Okay, so this is what the battlefield at Maldon would have looked like. This is an island in the River Blackwater called Northey. And connecting this island to the mainland is a causeway that you can cross when the river is low, right? So it's a natural land bridge, but it's not there all the time.
Didn't it say he came with 93 ships? Or they came from 93 ships to get to that one island.
Yeah.
And then they came off, kept going, waited for low tide, and then crossed the causeway.
Yeah, and why are they able to cross the causeway?
Low tide? Well,
Well, who doesn't stop them? Page 104, right?
104.
The flood went out. Eager the fleet men stood, the crowding raiders, ravening for battle. Then the hero's helm bade hold the causeway, a war-hard warrior, Wulfstan was his name, come of brave kin. It was this Kjola's son who with his Frankish spear struck down the first man there as he so boldly stepped onto the bridge's stonework. There stood with Wulfstan staunch warriors, Elfhera and Maccas, men of spirit, who would not take flight from the ford's neck, but fast defense, make against the foemen, the while that they might wield their weapons. When the hated strangers saw and understood what bitter bridge warders were brought against them, they began to plead with craft, craving leave to fare over the ford and lead across their footmen. So, what the poem is telling us here is that this causeway is narrow enough that 3 guys can hold it here, right?
Wulfstan and the 2 guys that are with him.
Yeah, Wulfstan, Elfhera, and Maccas are holding back this Viking tide just by holding on to the causeway, right? There's a. Have you ever seen the movie Braveheart?
Watch parts of it.
Okay.
I should watch it.
Well, the Battle of Stirling, which is supposed to be William Wallace's first great victory, is just like an ordinary pitched battle on a great big green battlefield in the movie, right? Historically, the battle is actually called the Battle of Stirling Bridge, because there is a very narrow bridge that leads into the town of Stirling. When Mel Gibson and his people were scouting locations to shoot, they went to Stirling, and they said, "We can't shoot a battle scene here. There's a bridge." And, a local Scot apparently said, "Yeah, that's what the English said." So yeah,
There's a bridge.
exactly. Yeah, like as long as you can kind of like hold them on the bridge, right? You've got a fairly easy. It's a choke point, right? You can easily defend from there. And then when the Vikings see they're getting creamed on the causeway, what do they do?
Ground is cleared for you. Wait, okay. Then the Earl was overswayed by his heart's arrogance to allow overmuch land to that loathed nation. The men stood silent as bright helm's sun called out over the cold water. The ground is cleared for you. Come quickly to us. Gather to battle. God alone knows who shall carry the wielding of this waste ground. The war wolves waded across moorland, not for the water. The Viking warrior band came west over Pant. Okay. Bearing shield boards over sheer water and up onto land, Lindenwood braced. Okay, so they flanked them.
Yeah. Well, what did they ask for? What did the Vikings ask for?
They asked for them to come out of the bridge.
Yeah. Come on, man, get off the bridge, right? Let us onto the land. Sorry.
Do you play a game called Warhammer, or any sort of RTS type?
I have played Warhammer. Yeah.
Okay. A lot of the strategy I love is that you have to tease your enemy out of their foothold, because their foothold, more or less, they have an advantage. They're on a hill, they're on a ridge, whatever. I do love that. Love hearing that there's a tactic that they use. That all the same sort of thing.
And Beartnock, because of Ulfhermode, right? What our translator here calls heart's arrogance, lets them through, and as Tolkien reads it, because of his sense of fair play, right? All right, let's have a fair pitched battle here.
They're screaming at 3 guys, "Hey, come over here.
Yeah.
Let's have a fair battle."
Yeah. Let's just have our armies meet in the field here, right? And this even the poem, regards, as much as it seems to admire Beardnot and his men, as a fatal mistake. Right? This is not a good idea. And we see what happens over the course of the rest of the poem to Beardnot's war band as a result, right? We have several of his kinsmen slain. Beardnot himself is killed. And then most of his thanes, those who didn't run away, give speeches indicating why they will stand and fight, right? That they will stay and defend the body.
Because weird.
Yeah, in part because weird, and also because loyalty, right?
Right.
And I think it's interesting to note here as well, if we look at the guys who speak, each one has slightly, like kind of one extra step removed from Beardnot in some way. Right, so we start with Elfwina, who we're told is a kinsman. Right, Alpha is a friend and lieutenant who early in the part of the poem that we had makes an oath that he's going to stand by Beardnot. After Alpha, a humbler warrior by the name of Lelsunu also speaks. He's part of the war band but doesn't seem to have any personal connection to Beardnot. And then the humble churl, Donera. Now this is important because Donera wouldn't even be part, like if he's a humble churl, this means he's a peasant. He wouldn't actually even be part of the war band. He's just part of like the local militia called the Feared that the Lord raises in time of trouble, right? Basically, you just get as many guys together as you can, arm them with spears, give them a little bit of rudimentary training, and send them in the direction of the enemy.
And he stays and fight because respect, even though he knows he'll lose. Okay.
Yeah, he said, the humble churl called out over all, a man cannot linger when his lord lies unavenged among Vikings, cannot value breath. And the last of the men to make a speech, Ashfurth, is a hostage in Beardnot's court from Northumbria. Now, are you familiar with what hostage meant in medieval context?
Not necessarily in medieval context.
Okay, yeah. So Ashfurth is not somebody who's been kidnapped by Beardnot as being held for ransom. What hostage in this case means is somebody who has been given into the care of another lord or another family in order to secure peace, right? So as part of a deal between Beardnot and some lord in Northumbria, Ashfurth has been placed in Beardnot's household. So he has no particular reason to be loyal to Beardnot.
And Northumbria, that was not the Irish, it was the...
Northumbria is a Saxon kingdom. But Northumbria is the Saxon kingdom that encompasses what is now northern England and southern Scotland.
Okay, so there were Scots in the southern area. And north of that.
No, the Scots would have been north of there. And there were some Britons in the kingdom of Strathclyde, which was kind of within Northumbria, but was its own political entity. It's complicated.
Okay, so Saxon south, north was Scott.
Yeah, north of all the Saxon kingdoms is what was the Scots.
Okay.
Yeah.
And everything in that little circle of that area is Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah. So if we're looking back at this map, right? Our battle is happening around here, and yeah, everything except Strathclyde, Wales, and this little corner of what's now England called Dumnonia, all that is Anglo-Saxon territory. So this is all under the control of the House of Wessex. So to get back to Tolkien's reading of this particular episode, right? His argument is that Beartnot is seeking after what Anglo-Saxon poets called lof and dom. Lof meaning praise, and dom meaning something like reputation. And that his desire for lof and dom overwhelms his good sense and his responsibility to keep his people safe.
And Beowulf sort of type character.
Yeah. Although at the very least we can say in Beowulf's, he actually talks about this in the essay, that at least in Beowulf's first adventure, he is putting himself at risk. Excuse me, beard here gets to be a problem in this thing. You probably know that problem. In his first adventure, Beowulf isn't responsible for anyone really but himself. It would be incredibly irresponsible for Hrothgar to go off and fight Grendel. But Beowulf is in a foreign country. He's not a king, he's not a lord, he's just a warrior. So it's perfectly appropriate for him to go looking for loaf and dome. Now when he's an old man, he's king, and he is responsible for his people, then going off after the dragon and dismissing his warband in Tolkien's reading is a terrible idea and is bloody irresponsible. Beardknot falls into that mistake. And I think it's interesting too to look at Beardknot's prayer as he's dying. On page 107. I give thee thanks, Lord God of hosts, for I have known in this world a wealth of gladness, but now, mild Maker, I have most need that thou grant my ghost grace for this journey, so that my soul may unscathed cross into thy keeping. King of angels, pass through in peace. My prayer is this, that the hates of hell may not harm her. So Beardknot's reputation is as a pious man who gives generously to monasteries and so on and so forth, is quite religious. Does this sound like the prayer of someone who is certain of what is going to happen to his soul?
Oh, his soul? No.
Yeah, he's certain of what's going to happen to his body,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. His soul, not so much.
Yeah, that's a foregone conclusion. But what makes the state of his soul here sound doubtful?
Well, he is praying before he dies. That's an average Christian.
Oh, sure,
thing.
sure.
Catholic especially.
Mm-hmm.
But what makes it sound like he's begging, more or less, thy keeping King of angels, pass through in peace. My prayer is this, that the hates of hell may not harm her. He's afraid of hell. He doesn't want to go to hell. He feels like he could go to hell for what he's about to do.
Yeah, I mean, who would want to, right? It's, the whole idea is it turns to be a punishment and all that, right? But yeah, so what's going on here is this is a literary trope that's common in late antiquity and in the early Middle Ages, especially in religious literature, weirdly. It's not quite theologically sound, but it's called the Judicium Particulare. Or in a judgment of the particular case. And the basic concept here that a Judicium Particulare illustrates is the notion of angels and devils fighting or arguing over a dead person's soul, right? So your soul leaves your body, and there's this kind of moment of hazard there, right? Where it could be picked up either by angels or by devils. And so he's requesting the protection of God so that it ends up in the hands of the angels and in God's keeping and not in the hands of devils. So what this suggests, again, is that the Christianity of the poem is not entirely orthodox, but has some things to do with something to do with folk religion and folk traditions. Now, a couple more things to say about this poem. Right? Do all of Beardenauth's Thanes stand with him?
And with what?
Do all of his Thanes stand with him?
There's a few that ran from battle.
Mm-hmm. Same page. Once he's hewed down, right? Then did the lack-willed leave the battlefield. Auda's kin came first away. Godric turned, betrayed the Lord, who had made him a gift of many good horses. He leapt onto the harness that had been Beardenauth's, unrightfully rode in his place, and with him and his brothers both ran, Godwina and Godwy, who had no gust for fighting. They wheeled from the war to the wood's fastness, sought shelter and saved their lives, and more went with them than were at all meet, had they called to mind the many heart claims Beardenauth had wrought them, worthying them. So there's something particularly galling about Godric's betrayal. What has Beardenauth given him while he's been in Beardenauth's service?
He'd given him land, I'm sure, or not land. He did give him gifts, as lords do.
Yeah.
And
but the specific gift matters here a lot. Godric turned, betrayed the Lord, who had made him a gift of many good horses. Right?
irony.
Yeah, exactly, right? And what does he do? He steals Beardenauth's horse and rides away. And because several others see Godric riding Beardenauth's horse, they think it's Beardenauth riding away, and they follow him. But the idea here as well is that horses are like someone giving you horses are a sign of special favor. Right? Horses are expensive. They take a lot of care in feeding, and they're militarily useful. So they're the sort of thing you give to someone you really trust.
It's the car.
Yeah. And Godric betrays that trust in spectacular fashion. Right? In the worst possible way. Now, one other thing to note about this poem, just in terms of its structure, right? We can guess how it ends because we know how the battle ended, but we don't actually have the beginning or the ending of the poem, right? This is not uncommon for poems that come down to us from medieval manuscripts, in part because one thing that we need to remember about medieval manuscripts is that they are composites, right? So they often feature snippets of various pieces or quotes of various pieces. Here's what we know about the book that the Battle of Maldon appeared. Right? It appeared at least in the form that we have it, in a single manuscript. That manuscript was in the collection of the antiquarian and book collector Sir Robert Cotton. At the time, a lot of the medieval manuscripts that we still have, we have because Cotton preserved them. But we don't have this manuscript anymore, because this was one of the ones that was destroyed in that 1731 fire. Now, even before any damage was done to it, the beginning and the end of the poem were already missing. The reason we still have the poem, though, is because someone had actually already made a transcription. Before the 1731 fire. So all contemporary translations of this poem are descended from that transcription of about 1726. So this is another one of those texts, like the survival of which is nothing short of miraculous.
Just like the burning of Alexandria, just hope it's...
Yeah. Okay, so I do want to talk a little bit about Brunanburh as well. What's the biggest difference between these two poems?
One was a victory.
Yeah. Brunanburh describes a victory, right? At the early end of the 10th century. The Battle of Maldon describes a military disaster near the end of the 10th century. Other differences can be found in who composed the enemy forces in each, right? So it's just a group of Vikings making a local raid in the Battle of Maldon. So the stakes are actually kind of small. Like we're not talking about, like, if they use the term Vikings in the poem, there's a difference between Vikings and Danes or Norsemen. Danes or Norsemen are typically, those terms are typically used to refer to invaders who come to settle or to conquer. Vikings is a term that is used almost exclusively to describe raiders. And this is, comes from from Old Norse itself, right? To go Viking is to go raiding. So I would say all Vikings are Norsemen, but not all Norsemen are Vikings. But then we actually now know that not all Vikings were Norsemen either. That Viking crews were often more ethnically diverse than we...
So like a mix of Germanic, maybe a little bit of... Aryan?
They probably would have been mostly Scandinavian, but they'd pick up warriors wherever they could. Think about say like pirate crews in the 16th and 17th centuries, right? They sail to the Caribbean, they pick up whoever's not busy, regardless of nationality, and they all go sailing off in search of plunder, right? It's a similar kind of thing.
So, like an Attila the Hun kind of thing, kind of picking up warriors as you go, making a bigger and bigger cavalry army.
Viking fleets were usually smaller and swifter.
Yeah.
Because again, like the purpose is a raid. They're not planning to stay. When we see bigger armies, then we're usually talking about Norsemen or Danes, because they are looking for land to carve out and to settle.
So they're almost entirely nomadic in that way. They come, they plunder, they sell, they leave.
Yeah, and they go home when the raiding season's over. They do their raiding, and then they come back. So they come back. They come back to Norway. They come back to Sweden. They come back to Denmark. or wherever they happen to be based. So yeah, they're not nomadic and they're not homeless, but they spend a good part of the year on the high seas. So the Battle of Brunanburh, we actually don't know the exact location of. We don't know where Brunanburh was. The best guess right now is that it took place right about here on this little jut of land coming off of Mercia. It's called the Wirral Peninsula, or just the Wirral. And today, it's mostly covered by suburbs of Liverpool. But yeah, like recent archaeological digs there have been promising, and have suggested that this might be the original battle site. It's also kind of like, given who the forces involved were, we had on the one hand the English, consisting of Anglo-Saxons and Jutes from throughout the island. Against the Dublin Norsemen, Scots, and Strathclyde Britons. This would be a reasonable place for that kind of battle to happen, right? So you've got Olaf Guthfrithson and his Vikings would have been coming from across the Irish Sea. This would be a convenient place for them to meet up with armies coming down from Scotland. So Brunanburh is an example of what we call panegyric. Again, like not an Anglo-Saxon poem, but do you know what a panegyric is? Have you heard this before? It's a Greek word, but have you heard this term before?
I read it. I didn't look it up yet.
Okay, so panegyric is a praise poem. And one thing that we get from this is an early statement of English nationalism. Right? Not that there is much sense yet of England as a unified nation, right? What we still have are 7 kingdoms that Athelstan just happens to be king of, and that his brother Edmund will later be king of. In fact, at the time of the battle, Athelstan was about 40, and Edmund was only about 16. They were half brothers.
Oh, okay. And after Athelstan's. Okay.
Yeah, and then Edmund takes the throne after Athelstan. Athelstan the king, captain of men, ring-giver of warriors, and with him his brother, Edmund the Atheling, unending glory won in that strife by their swords' edges that there was about Brunanburh. The board wall they cut through, cleft the lindens with the leavings of hammers, Edward's offspring, answering the blood they had from their forebears. That in the field they should often against every foe defend the land, hoard, and homes. So the whole idea about being Edward's offspring and the blood they had from their forebears, like what this is emphasizing is, right, the heritage of this house of Wessex, right, these descendants of Alfred, right? We've got a real sense of a royal family and a royal line now, right?
And all its little intricate little...
What's that?
All its little intricate feuds and such.
Yeah. But at the same time, right, so we've got this, okay, we're unified now behind these leaders.
And the Wessex, they're the people that not conquered, but like unified the kingdoms more later.
Yeah. Alfred was king of Wessex. Technically, Athelstan is also king of Wessex, but he's a Bretwalda. The other kingdoms acknowledge his lordship, right?
Okay, so Alfred is the main king, and we got Jarl.
No, Alfred is I think, grandfather of Athelstan. Edward's his father.
And then
Athelstan and Edmund are brothers. So so we have a line of descent here, right? Alfred isn't mentioned in the poem, but he is he's the one who starts this particular line.
Right, and then they unify England later. Not Alfred himself, but his line unifies England.
Yeah, well, Alfred is acknowledged lord of all of these kingdoms.
So
he's the one who defeats the Vikings, at least temporarily, and as a result, all of the other kingdoms acknowledge his overlordship. It's still hard to say there's an official king of England by 937, but the House of Wessex are the most powerful kings in England, and everybody else acknowledges them as lords. So while it might be difficult to say that technically Athelstan is king of England, to all intents and purposes he is, as his father Edward would have been and his grandfather Alfred.
okay, so kind of like Roma back in Rome, before all the kingdoms became an empire, Roma was the main one, while the other kingdoms acknowledged that was the biggest and strongest power in the kingdom. Okay.
Yeah, and if Wessex calls for aid to the others, they're expected to answer. The hated ones fell, the people of the Scots and the shipmen too, fell as was fated. The field was running with the blood of soldiers from the sun's rise at the hour of the morning when that marvelous star, God's bright candle, glided over the lands, to the time when the creature of the eternal Lord sank to rest. Then, sated with battle and weary, lay many there, men of the northerners, shot above their shields, and Scots men likewise, wasted by spears. The West Saxons rode in troop right through the day, hard on the heels of the hated people, pursuing, hewed fiercely at the fleeing warriors with mill-sharpened swords. Does there seem to be any interest here in the kind of fair fight that Bernard was trying to go? Like here, like the enemy is running away, right? And Athelstan and his troops are still just running them down, right? Running them right out of the country.
And earlier you said this was written around the time where he was still ruling. Therefore, he had his influence on what should be said.
Yeah, well, I think Athelstan died not too long after the Battle of Brunanburh, but his family still would have been around, still would have been ruling, the poem is probably composed within about 20 years of the battle.
Okay.
Yeah, so probably not immediately afterward, but yeah, with definitely within living memory of the battle. The Mercians did not refuse the hard hand play to any hero among those who with Anlaf over the ocean's courses in the bosom of a ship had sought our land and their doom in that fight. There were 5 kings who in their youth lay low on that battlefield, slain by the sword, and 7 earls of Anlafs also. Others without number of shipmen and Scots. With scant retinue, the prince of the Northmen was put to flight by stark need to the stern of his craft. The long ship drove out across the dark waters. The king slipped away, saved his life. The old king likewise came away also. The gray-haired campaigner Constantine, the king of the Scots, fled to the north he knew. He had no need to rejoice in that meeting of swords where he was shortened of kinsmen and deprived of friends on the field of assembly, plucked on the battlefield. On that place of slaughter he left his son, brought low by wounds, young on the battlefield. The yield of the swords gave no ground for boasting to the gray-haired chieftain, the old enemy, to Anlaf neither. So, why is it important that they note how many young kings in the enemy forces, and that their enemy Constantine, the king of Scotland's son, are killed in the battle? What does this suggest?
Propaganda, or not Well, yeah, kind of.
I mean, this poem is totally propaganda, right?
Yeah.
It's 100% House of Wessex propaganda. But what does this suggest then about their enemies and about their enemies' ability to assail them in the future?
They kind of want to dehumanize them, right?
It's less about dehumanization and more about saying that we have taken out an entire generation of our enemies' leaders.
So it's a flex. Okay.
Yeah. That these kings killed in their youth who followed Olaf, and Constantine's own son killed in his youth on the battlefield. This means that not only did Athelstan and Edmund defeat these kings and put them to flight, it means that they also secured our prosperity for another generation, right? Now, I think it's interesting to compare this with the Battle of Maldon and the fate of Wulfmare on page 105. Right? It was then that Wulfmare was wounded. War rest chose Byrhtnoth's kinsman. He was beaten down, his sister's son under the sword's flailing. Now, sister's son means more than just nephew. One thing that we know from the history of the period is that Byrhtnoth had a daughter, but he had no sons. So in cases like that, if a lord had no son of his own, the line of succession then went to his sister's oldest son.
So, and Wulfmare's son, so Byrhtnoth's sister, okay, and her husband was Wulfmare and his son. Okay, so the heir to the whole line.
Yeah, Wulfmare, who dies here, Byrhtnoth's kinsman, his sister's son, is the heir.
Oh, okay, Wulfmare is the
Wulfmare himself is the sister's son and is the heir, yeah.
Okay.
So we have like another parallel here, right? Where in Brunanburh, the victorious English wipe out a generation of enemy leaders. In the Battle of Maldon, in this military disaster, Byrhtnoth is killed along with most of his household, except for the cowards who run away. And the guy who should have succeeded him as alderman. So he's left his decision, based on his offermod, his hubris, has left his people bereft of leadership.
And just like Beowulf, the line just ends because Beowulf had no son.
Yep.
Byrhtnoth had no son, and he lost his nephew because of Byrhtnoth's ambition.
Yeah, or at least his desire to look like a hero, right? He's looking for loaf and dome. He's looking for praise and reputation. At least, again, like other people read this differently, but in Tolkien's reading of this, it's Byrhtnoth's desire to be the hero of a song that leads him to make this terrible decision. Because from a tactical standpoint, right, does it make any sense to give up your only advantage over your enemy? Typically not, right? Now, there's one more thing I want to point to here. It appears in both poems, but in more traditional form in Brunanburh. If you look on page 97, the nailed ships of the Norsemen took off what spears had spared, a spattered remnant, across deep Dingsmere to Dublin once more, to seek again Ireland in shame. The brothers also, both of them together, the king and the atheling, came away to their own, the West Saxon land in war triumph. The corpse sharers, shadowy coated, they left behind them. the black raven with its horny beak, the brown eagle of white tail feather to feast on the slain, greedy warhawk, and the gray one, the wolf of the weald. Do you know what's going on here? What these three animals are? I mean, I'm sure you know what they are, but...
Okay, greedy warhawk. The gray one, I'm figuring that's a wolf. And then wolf of the weald.
Yeah, I've got
So
the raven, the eagle, and the wolf, yeah.
I'm going to relate that to something else in my head.
Okay. Go ahead.
Those are sort of nicknames for other people.
They're not, they actually have nothing to do with people,
Oh.
except that they're eating people on the battlefield.
Okay, so an actual warhawk, raven, and wolf.
Yep.
Okay.
So the raven, the eagle, and the wolf are a traditional device in Germanic poetry called the beasts of battle. You see this more often in Norse poetry, in which case they're usually, like all of these animals are connected in some way to the god Odin, who is the one who scours the battlefield anyway to find warriors to bring to Valhalla. But we still find like echoes of this sometimes in Anglo-Saxon poetry, where the appearance of the beasts of battle indicates a great slaughter, right? Now, the extent to which they're connected to Odin or to ideas of fate is debatable. It seems almost more like a kind of, like I said, like a kind of echo or a kind of memory of earlier Germanic culture. But yeah, this is still a motif that appears frequently in the poetry.
It's weird how the raven. Wait, am I getting that mixed up with it? Never mind.
All right, so that's really what I wanted to cover today. Do you have any questions about anything?
I'll just go ahead and say what I was thinking. It's weird how Odin is symbolized by a raven,
Mm-hmm.
but in Greek mythology, that's the what's the Hera, or in her symbol a raven.
I don't recall Hera being directly. I mean, I could be wrong about this. I don't recall Hera being directly connected to the raven. I know that Odin, when the Romans first encountered Germanic peoples, they identified Odin not with Zeus, their king, father god, but with Mercury. Because both of those gods are what are called psychopomps. You know what a psychopomp is? Okay, so psychopomp is a being that conducts souls to the underworld.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's the function that Mercury and Hermes serve in Roman and Greek mythology, and it's also what Odin does in Norse mythology. Plus, the fact that Odin is a traveler god as well. He's mobile. He's all over the damn place.
Yeah, he goes from Asgard to Midgard and
Yep.
all those areas. Okay.
In fact, he's going to pop up, half a dozen times in the saga of the Volsungs. Just, he just shows up out of nowhere, says something cryptic, and leaves.
Oh, you guys are fighting? Okay, I'll say something. I'll do something. I'll fight. I'll join in. I like a good fight.
Yeah. All right, so let me give you the reading questions for next time. And then we're all set. We'll see you Monday.